The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Francis Scott Fitzgerald.
Part 2. The Mechanisms of Life.
Well then, in the first part of this book, we were merely assembling the frame or border of our puzzle. This frame consists of 4 main building blocks. The first block is a foundational premise at the level of philosophy, or more precisely, metaphysics, the dual nature of reality. The second block is the presentation of this duality in the form of 2 inter-organizing worlds, the objective realm of energy and the subjective realm of information. These 2 worlds interact through a kind of two-way membrane, life. All living beings perceive the realm of energy as a collection of texts, and they are capable of interpreting these objectively existing texts within their own subjective contexts. The third block is the concept of the model of the universe. Using this concept, we finally formulated that life is a process of cognition, and the purpose of life is to discover a fully adequate model of the universe. And finally, the fourth block is the highly useful metaphor of Missy and her cells, which has already helped us begin to understand what God is, and just how vast and impassable the chasm is between Him and us. This metaphor will continue to serve us in later chapters. In the second part of the book, several major central pieces of our puzzle will come into view. Many of them will begin to connect with each other through logical bridges, and, of course, with the frame we've already built. Still, I'm afraid the overall picture of the puzzle will likely remain unclear, at least until we dive deeper into the material of Part 3. The main goal of this second part is to uncover the general properties and regularities by which life originates, exists, and evolves. I should note, however, that this section is a bit more complex than the previous one. It assumes the reader has a good grasp of high school biology and chemistry, and is at least somewhat familiar with the basics of mathematical logic. So, dear friends, welcome to the second part of Alexander Neshmonin's book, Changing the Paradigm of Life.
Discreteness.
We've all heard it before. Everything in this world, whether entities, phenomena, or processes, falls into one of 2 categories, continuous or discrete. So, here's the first interesting conclusion we can draw about life. It's always discrete. Let's start with the fact that all living things are spatially limited. Life never exists as a substance or an environment. There's no such thing as living air or living water. Life is always contained, always concentrated in distinct, separate, discrete beings, like bacteria, plants, animals, etc. Every living thing has some kind of physical boundary, a body within which life exists. Sometimes it's tricky to outline these boundaries. Take an anthill, for example. Its body is made up of individual ants sprawling over a large area. But the organism itself always knows where its boundaries are and can precisely say where me ends and not me begins. In this sense, we can confidently say that all life is discrete in space.
But what about time?
Of course. Life is discrete in time as well, because every living thing is characterized by a lifespan, right?
Well, sure, but we live continuously from birth to death.
But is our life really that continuous? Let's dig in. First question, what do we actually remember from our supposedly continuous life? Do we recall it as one uninterrupted flow or as a series of events? For example, can you remember what you were doing the Wednesday before last? Chances are, after some effort, you'll recall maybe 2 key moments. Changed the oil in the car and ran into an old classmate I hadn't seen in a decade. You might add some routine activities, woke up, brushed my teeth, walked the dog, went to work, and that's about it. So while processes objectively flow continuously, our subjective perception of them is quite discrete. And trust me, the older you get, the more discrete it becomes.
Hold on. Memory is discrete, fine. But our present perception is continuous, isn't it?
Is it, though? Here's where things get interesting. The author of these lines is inclined to argue that all living beings subjectively perceive reality as a series of events, that is, discretely. Let's start with physiology. All living things perceive reality through receptors, sense organs. Every receptor has a threshold and differential sensitivity. For example, we don't smell something immediately, we only register it once. The concentration of odor molecules in the air reaches a certain threshold. At that moment, we register a discrete event. The pie in the kitchen is starting to smell good. Then differential sensitivity kicks in. We don't notice a change in the smell right away, but only when the concentration of those molecules increases by a significant enough amount. And here, again, we register a discrete event. Looks like the pie's starting to burn. So, what is objectively a continuous process, we subjectively perceive as a chain of discrete events. In other words, any process can be described both objectively, continuously, and subjectively, discretely, dually. And this is the part where I'm tempted to bring up wave and particle theories of light, but we'll save that for appendices.
Well, fine. Maybe we perceive smells discretely, but sight and hearing, those are definitely continuous, right?
Oh, I'd love to debate that with you. Both sight and hearing also have threshold and differential sensitivities. So no matter how you slice it, signals from these receptors hit the brain discretely. What's different is that the brain has this amazing ability to stitch together a series of discrete events into what feels like a continuous flow of music or motion. In fact, humans have been using this brain trick in television and movies for ages. They just show us rapidly changing frames, and our brain happily interprets them as smooth, continuous movement, no effort required. We've mentioned the word event a few times now, so let's clarify. What exactly do we mean by that? Remember the Newton's first law. The simplified version we learned in school goes something like this. An object at rest or in uniform motion will remain that way unless acted upon by an external force. Ring a bell? That's from the realm of energy. In the realm of information, the equivalent rule would be a living being in the absence of significant events remains either at rest or engaged in routine activities. So, here's our working definition.
An event is a subjective informational stimulus capable of shifting a living being from one state to another.
For example, the smell of a burning pie jolts us out of our seat and sends us racing to the kitchen to rescue it from the oven. We can extend the parallel between the laws of the realm of energy and the realm of information, the non-living and the living. In the realm of energy, a force, an energetic stimulus, is somewhat analogous to the measure of surprise, which is the amount of information, in the realm of information. In the realm of energy, the greater the force, the greater the acceleration. Similarly, in the realm of information, the more surprising an event, the more decisively it can change our state. But the key word here is can. Living beings possess this little thing called free will, meaning they have the ability to react unpredictably to certain events. Any married man will readily confirm this. This particular conclusion, that life's reaction to events is unpredictable, may seem trivial, but we'll definitely make good use of it in appendices. For now, though,
Summary.
Life is discrete in both space and time. Life perceives objective reality through discrete informational stimuli, events. An event is a subjective informational stimulus capable of shifting a living being from one state to another.
Spontaneous improvement.
we've all been taught since school that all living things evolve over time, progressing from simple forms to more complex ones. But let's take a closer look. What exactly is this complexification? And more importantly, what laws govern it? What's driving life to get more complicated in the first place? After the chapter, What is the Meaning of Life?, we now understand that the self-improvement of life is, in a broad sense, a continuous process of refining, expanding, deepening, and competitively selecting the model of the universe. This process is called cognition. But how does this happen? First, we need to clarify something. With very, very rare exceptions, individual life forms, species, don't really get more complex themselves. They simply go on reproducing within their ecological niche. But when one of these species happens to win the mutation lottery, it leads to the birth of a new life startup, a daughter evolutionary branch. This doesn't always result in the complete disappearance of the parent branch either. For example, chimpanzees and humans share a common ancestor. At some point, the chimpanzee branch split off, and then, very reluctantly, the human branch followed, or maybe it was the other way around, doesn't matter. Since those ancient paleontological times, the chimpanzee startup has staked out its business niche and hasn't really rethought its business model, its model of the universe. Meanwhile, the human startup developed a business model that allowed it to spread across the entire planet, take over or buy out hundreds of other startups, eliminate the most dangerous or stubborn competitors, and assume the position of the almighty monopolistic dictator of nature. The human startup continues to actively complicate its business model, while living beings with less adequate models of the universe effectively fertilize the soil, creating conditions for the further refinement, expansion, and deepening of the champion model. Now for the important part. I'm convinced that all these gradual refinements, expansions, and deepening of the models of the universe follow the laws of mathematical logic. So, what is logic? Intuitively, we think of logic as a special ability to reason, a certain rigor and coherence of thought that, in scientific discussions, sometimes helps avoid fistfights with your opponents. In such debates, after scratching our heads and begrudgingly putting away the figurative middle finger in our pocket, we declare,
"Well, what can I say? That's logical."
In doing so, we're essentially acknowledging that the formal structure of the reasoning, what we call logic, is inherently sound. In the natural world, the improvement of the model of the universe, evolution, happens through blind trial and error. To successfully deepen or expand a functioning model of the universe, many thousands of failed mutations must occur, with only one managing to pass the test of life and get locked in. But we humans have mastered a method thousands, if not millions, of times more efficient for expanding and deepening our model of the universe, cognition through logic, mathematics. Using this method, we successfully refine and expand our model of the universe simply by finding logical chains of cause and effect between its previous and next versions. In other words, what nature stumbles upon blindly, we achieve by applying the laws of mathematical logic.
Every step in successfully improving the model of the universe must follow the laws of mathematical logic.
If that's the case, we can easily formulate a concept of the simplest model of the universe, that is, the model that must have been adopted by the first, most primitive living being, and which all later generations and modifications of models of the universe have been building on and refining. The simplest possible operator in mathematical Boolean logic is the identity operator. This is an unary operator, meaning it only works with one operand, just itself. This basic operator allows anything to be checked for whether it is identical or not identical to itself. In other words, by executing this simplest logical action, any living thing, like a kitten in front of a mirror, can answer the question, is this thing me or not me? Clearly, no simpler model of the universe could exist than this. The universe is everything outside of me, everything that is not me. A more advanced model of the universe must already be capable of distinguishing between beneficial, good, and dangerous, bad entities or phenomena. That is, it needs to learn how to divide the universe into friends and foes. More on that in the next chapter. To do so, this more developed, we'll call it social, model of the universe will have to adapt more complex binary operators from mathematical logic, conjunction and disjunction. Something along the lines of,
Universe is everything that is not me.
And then,
Me and friend is good. Me and foe is bad.
Then it goes further.
The friend of my friend is my friend. The enemy of my friend is my enemy. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Obviously, this cannot be final. For instance, the enemy of my enemy isn't always going to be your friend, so it forces life to constantly develop and refine this model, making it broader, deeper, and more nuanced by adopting increasingly complex statements from mathematical logic. However, the ability to distinguish between me and not me remains the foundational concept of any model of the universe. And this concept is undeniably inherited by all living beings. Now we've arrived at a crucial conclusion here. Every living being must at least understand what me is and be able to distinguish between me and not me. Let's call this fundamental property of life agency.
Agency is the ability of any living being to understand what me is and the ability to recognize the difference between me and not me.
Without the understanding of what is me, it is impossible to maintain one's internal state, homeostasis. After all, to do this, one must be able to distinguish between external events and internal events. External events are those that come from the universe, from not me, and may, for example, harm or even kill me, so it's crucial to react appropriately to them. Internal events, on the other hand, are of an entirely different nature. These need to be interpreted and understood to adjust, balance, and coordinate internal physiological processes to maintain homeostasis. And now we've reached a very interesting discovery. As soon as we define the property of agency in life, we can now understand the mechanism behind its spontaneous improvement. In other words, we can answer the question, what constantly and relentlessly drives life towards self-improvement? The fact is, the division of the universe into me and not me creates an unsolvable logical problem that can be framed as follows.
Subjectively, the universe is not me. Objectively, me is part of the universe.
More than 500 years BC, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus developed a philosophical concept of change. You've probably heard, everything changes, where he introduced the idea of the unity of opposites. Over 2,000 years later, this idea was shamelessly borrowed by the German philosopher Georg Hegel and revolutionary journalist Friedrich Engels. According to the teachings of Heraclitus and Hegel-Engels, the driving force behind the development, evolution, of any system is the presence of what they called a dialectical contradiction within that system. And here we are, observing just such an internal contradiction between the agentic me and the objective universe.
As life learns about the universe, it becomes more complex, and in doing so, it makes the universe itself more complex, because after all, life is a part of the universe. As a result, life is forced to cognize an increasingly complex universe, which, in turn, forces it to further complicate itself, and so on.
This leads us to a very fundamental conclusion.
Cognition is always accompanied by change, and change is always accompanied by cognition.
This conclusion, which we've reached at a philosophical level, will no doubt please physicists who are puzzled as to why, in the quantum world, the very act of observation, cognition, affects the outcome of that observation, leading to change. But more on that in part 3 of this book. Returning to the cognition and changes.
The inherent, irresolvable contradiction within life, between the agentic me and the objective universe, forces life to continuously cognize and change the universe.
This contradiction is like a carrot dangled in front of a foolish donkey. It relentlessly drives life in an enchanted circle. At every step of complication, at every level of hierarchy, life struggles to resolve the primary, fundamental contradiction of me versus the universe. These efforts are, by definition, doomed to failure, yet life tries again and again, and each time the result is the same. These futile attempts strongly remind me of the never-ending renovations in my apartment. However, unlike that seemingly endless loop, this is not a cursed circle, but rather an upward spiral. Life's painful efforts are not in vain. Unbeknownst to itself, life is inevitably working its way toward a more and more adequate model of the universe.
Summary.
Every successful step in the improvement of the model of the universe must follow the laws of mathematical logic. Agency is the ability of any living being to understand what me is and distinguish between me and not me. Cognition is always accompanied by change, and change is always accompanied by cognition. The inherent contradiction within life, between the agentic me and the objective universe, forces life to continuously cognize and change the universe.
The hierarchical nature of life.
In the chapter, What is God?, we used the metaphor of Missy the cell and agreed that life can exist on multiple levels. In our metaphor, we considered 2 levels, cells and Missy, But if we think about it, we can identify at least one more intermediate level in the life of a multicellular organism, the level of organs. Why can we classify organs as a distinct level? Because after Missy, as the organism level dies, her organs can continue to live for some time. They can even be transplanted into other animals, right? And when the organs finally stop functioning, some of the cells that make them up are still alive, metabolizing, for a while longer before they too become non-living. Let's figure out how it happens that life suddenly organizes itself into a hierarchy. After all, according to the theory of Charles Darwin, familiar to us since school days, the main driver of evolution is natural selection, or, to put it simply, intra- and interspecies competition. But if everything boiled down to competition, then single-celled organisms should have spent billions of years simply competing for better conditions. Nothing would have pushed them to band together into organisms. It seems Darwin simply overlooked another powerful driving force of evolution, intra- and interspecies cooperation. In the previous chapter, when we introduced the concept of agency, we noted that right after the fundamental contradiction of me versus not me, the very first level of complexity for the simplest model of the universe must be the ability to distinguish between beneficial, good, and dangerous and bad entities or phenomena. In other words, the ability to divide the universe into friends and foes. Back then we called such a model the social model of the universe. In other words,
the first natural instinct of living beings is the urge to unite with friends, cooperation, and separate from enemies, competition.
It's only thanks to cooperation that solitary, scattered cells come together and create something qualitatively new, multicellular organisms. The same cooperative instinct drives animals to form herds and packs, insects to build swarms and anthills, and humans to create families, tribes, communities, and nations. Cooperation lays the groundwork for specialization of individual elements within an organism, which in turn requires coordination and management for the survival of the whole, the organism. This marks a higher level in life's hierarchy, a level where the entire organism becomes a new me and everything else is seen as not me. And when it comes to each individual element of the organism,
for any social living being, beyond the me, not me contradiction, there's also the contradiction of me, us, where us is the friendly part of the universe, including the me.
Why is me, us, a contradiction? Because every living being constantly has to decide what matters more, me or us. Cooperation can be very deep or, on the contrary, quite superficial. It all depends on the level of autonomy of the cooperating being. But we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. Well then, all these reflections on cooperation are presented here for one reason only, to justify the following conclusion for you.
Life consists of levels, with each higher level of the hierarchy standing on the shoulders of the previous lower level.
If we agree that life is inherently hierarchical, then why should we stop at cells as the lowest and most primitive level of life? We've already established that the very bottom step in life's hierarchy must be occupied by a form of life whose model of the universe is the simplest possible, namely, the universe is everything that is not me. But if you recall in the chapter What is the Meaning of Life, we already established that even a single-celled amoeba has a far more complex model of the universe. And in a multicellular organism, every cell can recognize and appropriately respond to thousands of different external conditions, more or less nutrients, the rise or fall of levels of dozens of hormones, whether it's time to divide or not yet, etc. Not to mention, a cell can mount incredibly complex immune responses to viral attacks and retain immunological memory across many generations of cells. Moreover, a cell isn't a simple creature. Each cell contains undeniably foreign living elements, mitochondria. Mitochondria have their own independent hereditary mechanism. By studying this mechanism, geneticists can trace your maternal lineage. In other words, a cell is essentially a kind of symbiosis of independent living entities from two different species. No, dear reader, a cell cannot be the first and most primitive level in the hierarchy of life. Its model of the universe is far too complex for that. There must be at least one more, simpler level of the hierarchy beneath the cellular one. Let's try to imagine such a level. Cells are made up of proteins, just as Missy is made up of cells. So does that mean proteins are alive too? That sounds a bit too unusual, if not downright insane.
Proteins? Alive? Are you out of your mind?
First of all, so you don't keep flinching every time, let's agree on how we'll refer to the different levels of life hierarchy. Calling all of them alive isn't just counterintuitive, it's methodologically incorrect. It's like trying to describe all our tactile sensations in terms of pain. Pain is just one particular level of tactile perception. Alongside it, there are sensations like a breeze, a touch, a firm handshake, and so on, all of which are qualitatively different things. So let's continue calling only the familiar cellular forms of life, bacteria, plants, and organisms, alive. And the more primitive forms, which, as we've established, must exist, we'll refer to as proto-living. That will more accurately reflect reality.
Proto-living entities are representatives of forms of life that exist in the hierarchy below the cellular level.
Thus, there are proto-living levels of life's hierarchy upon which the living levels rest. The level above them could perhaps be called the intelligent level. And for the sake of completeness, let's give a generalized term for all of these entities. Since all living things possess agency, I will refer to all known and unknown representatives of life as agentic entities, italicized and capitalized.
An agentic entity is a discrete element of matter capable of maintaining its own homeostasis through its own model of the universe.
At this point, the reader might exclaim,
Why not consider a dull stone to be your agentic entity? I mean, why not imagine that a stone has its own model of the universe, through which it perfectly maintains its homeostasis?
I promise, you'll get an answer to this perfectly reasonable question, just not now. We'll get to it in the Chapter 8 of Part 2. So, could proteins be proto-living? Could they be considered agentic entities?
Well, why not? It does sound rather unusual, but I always remember how strange and absurd it seemed to me as a child when I first learned that trees are also alive. What do you mean, alive? The horsey and the doggy are alive because they run and eat. But trees don't run, don't eat. How could they be alive? Something doesn't add up here.
I think many readers had similar thoughts in childhood, but over time, we all just got used to this initially bizarre idea. What can we say about proteins? The vast diversity of proteins forms an entire intracellular civilization, much like the familiar diversity of cells forms the civilization that sustains an organism. Just as cells serve the body, proteins serve their host cell, carrying out a wide range of functions: protective, regulatory, signaling, transport, receptor-based, motor, and more. Proteins are somehow able to spontaneously fold into insanely complex, three-dimensional molecular structures, structures whose physical and chemical properties differ radically from those of a chemically identical compound laid out as a single unfolded strand. Proteins are extraordinarily stable across a wide range of external conditions. More impressively, they can repair themselves, restoring their three-dimensional structure after denaturation entirely on their own. They can also alter their chemical properties, becoming acidic or alkaline depending on the circumstances, and perform countless other sophisticated feats. All of this tells us first of all that we're dealing with agentic entities, and second, that their models of the universe are quite developed. That is, still very, very far from the binary simplicity of me versus the universe. Which means, logically, that there must be a level below proteins in the hierarchy of life. And by now, I trust your intuition has long since whispered, there will be many more levels yet to come. But we'll get into that in the part 3 of the book. For now,
Summary.
The first natural instinct of living beings is the drive to unite with friends, cooperation, and separate from enemies, competition. For any social living being, in addition to the me, not me contradiction, there's also the me, us contradiction, where us is the friendly part of the universe, including the me. Life consists of levels, with each higher level of the hierarchy standing on the shoulders of the lower one. Proto-living entities are forms of life that exist in the hierarchy below the cellular level. An agentic entity is a discrete element of matter that can maintain its homeostasis thanks to its own model of the universe.
Quasi-Organisms and Info-cloning.
the topic of this chapter could easily fill an entire book, but we'll aim to just skim the surface. That should be enough to understand the material that follows. Let's start by recalling that in the chapter, What is the Meaning of Life?, we defined the concept of the model of the universe, a reflection of the behavioral scheme adapted by agentic entities to maintain their homeostasis. An agentic entity doesn't think about the universe in terms like, the universe consists of this and that which interacts with such and such. No, it simply knows a set of scenarios and reactions, meaning it can recognize certain situations and respond to them appropriately. In that same chapter, I promised the reader that we'd return to the question of the differences between context and the model of the universe. At this point, we know that context is the sum of knowledge about oneself and the surrounding world of just one particular living being or proto-living entity of a certain species, whereas the model of the universe is something like the integral collective context of the entire population of beings, entities of that species. First, let's clarify how far apart individual contexts can be from the corresponding group knowledge, the model of the universe. If we're talking about the context of a single human and the model of the universe of humanity, then humanity's model of the universe is always guaranteed to be broader and deeper than any individual's context. Even the most brilliant and well-informed person cannot know or master everything that humanity has accumulated. We're born with practically zero context, and as we grow, we interpret a vast number of different texts received from parents, peers, teachers, as well as from books, media, the internet, etc. Step by step, interpreting all these texts' forms expands and deepens our individual context.
Learning is the step-by-step formation of individual context through the interpretation of various texts.
Now, Let's take a look at how things stand with the context of brainless entities, plants, bacteria, proteins, and other proto-living entities. It turns out that the individual contexts of lower forms of life are practically indistinguishable from the corresponding group model of the universe, since these contexts are not formed through learning, but are somehow innately received. For over 100 years, biologists have used the very vague term instinct, which they define as innate behavioral patterns that do not require learning or experience. Unfortunately, biologists have no real understanding of how this mysterious instinct program gets loaded into a living creature. The only clear thing is this: unlike classical learning, where context is formed step by step through the interpretation of texts, in the case of instinct, context appears almost instantaneously and in its entirety. For example, no one teaches a mosquito how to fly or explains to it how to track down a juicy, though strangely aggressive, blood-filled creature called a human. The mosquito somehow immediately knows how to find food and how to obtain it. This knowledge and skill context are inexplicably loaded into it from birth, straight from the common mosquito model of the universe. Let's now, within the paradigm of the great life, theorize about how lower forms of life might already have a fully formed context right from the moment of birth. In other words, how they acquire this thing we call instinct. It seems to me that what we're dealing with here are certain quasi-organisms. For example, one such quasi-organism is called mosquitoes. This quasi-organism has been living for many hundreds of thousands of years across vast territories, virtually the entire solid surface of the Earth, except perhaps Antarctica. Each individual mosquito is something like a cell in a traditional organism, a kind of autonomous tentacle, while all mosquitoes on the planet together form the body of this quasi-organism.
A quasi-organism is a representative of life, whose body is not enclosed within a single continuous shell, but instead takes the form of a colony of similar, autonomous agentic entities, belonging to a lower level of life's hierarchy.
Just as a cell in a traditional organism is born already knowing and capable of everything its neighboring cells know and can do, so too a newly born mosquito knows and can do everything its neighboring mosquitoes can. It seems that the instinct of each individual mosquito is literally the context of this greater quasi-organism. That is, mosquitoes simply share common access to that context. In other words, the quasi-organism simply clones its collective context, that is, its model of the universe, into the individual contexts of its newborn members.
Info-cloning is the mechanism by which the contexts of similar agentic entities are formed through shared access to the context of the quasi-organism that generates them.
The same can be said of the quasi-organism birches, the quasi-organism ferns, the quasi-organism chlorella, the quasi-organism streptococcus bacteria, and of many millions of other quasi-organisms we collectively refer to as species of lower life forms. From the chapter, What is God? We remember that for any agentic entity, God is simply the consciousness of a being that exists on a higher level of life's hierarchy. Therefore, we can say that lower and proto-living forms of life are almost dissolved within their God. That is, they are practically inseparable from their quasi-organism.
And does the quasi-organism humans exist?
If we're talking about the preloaded program of our reflexes and instincts, then we shouldn't be referring to a quasi-organism called humans, but rather to a quasi-organism called hairless apes. After all, an info-cloned but untrained Mowgli isn't a human in the social sense of the word. Thus, the quasi-organism hairless apes represents the level of the life hierarchy directly above ours. That is, it is our very own Missy. And the consciousness of this quasi-organism is none other than our very own God.
Our God is the consciousness of the quasi-organism hairless apes.
Disappointed? Surprised? You shouldn't be. Every one of our animal reflexes and instincts comes from this quasi-creature.
So where then does all our humanity come from? Surely there must be a quasi-organism humans as well.
As I mentioned earlier, that's a topic for a whole separate book. I hope that after becoming familiar with the paradigm of the great life, readers will develop their own ideas on the matter. For instance, psychologists might associate the consciousness of the quasi-organism humans with Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. Sociologists might link it to the idea of the collective consciousness, and fans of esoterica to the notion of the egregore. In my opinion, all these ideas are worth serious consideration, whereas in the framework of the paradigm of the great graveyard, they've always been regarded as purely fringe. And just a few more words about the relationship between individuality and uniformity in agentic entities. Each individual mosquito, or each individual birch tree, bacterium, and so on, differs from each individual human in that it possesses almost no individuality. As we've previously established, individuality is achieved through learning, and mosquitoes, as well as birches, bacteria, and the like, have a very limited capacity for learning. In other words, the context of any living or proto-living being is always a kind of blend of individuality and uniformity. That is, a mix of the results of learning and info-cloning. Learning is a much more complex and, it should be noted, rather unreliable, since every time you have to start from scratch, handcrafted method of forming individual contexts. However, it provides enormous diversity in competing ideas and viewpoints, and thus life can comparatively quickly arrive at an extremely developed model of the universe. Info-cloning, on the other hand, is an incredibly reliable industrial method of forming individual contexts, but as a technology for cognition, it's far less promising. All individuals of the species turn out exactly the same, so the improvement of its model of the universe can only occur through lucky mutations. In other words, it seems that
the dominance of individuality over uniformity in identical agentic entities is a sign of a more advanced model of the universe in that form of life.
This is a very important conclusion, and it will come in handy in appendices. But for now,
Summary.
A quasi-organism is a representative of life, whose body is not enclosed in a single continuous shell, but is a colony of identical, autonomous agentic entities of a lower level in the hierarchy of life. Learning is the step-by-step formation of an individual context through the interpretation of various texts. Info-cloning is the mechanism by which the context of agentic entities is formed through shared access to the context of the quasi-organism that constitutes them. Our God is the consciousness of the quasi-organism hairless apes. The dominance of individuality over uniformity in identical agentic entities is a sign of a more advanced model of the universe in that form of life.
Death and the emergence of life.
in this chapter, we'll answer one of the most intriguing questions of existence. Where does life come from at birth, and where does it go after death? To understand this, we need to recall that in addition to the self-improvement of the realm of information, there is an opposing process, the degradation of the realm of energy. The process of degradation is characterized by the principle of entropy as described by the second law of thermodynamics. If self-improvement leads to the internal organization of matter becoming more complex, then degradation conversely simplifies it. So it turns out that
everything in reality either evolves, spontaneously becoming more complex, or degrades, spontaneously becoming simpler.
Let's now look at the events marking the beginning of simplification, death, and the beginning of complexity, emergence, in terms of the life hierarchy we're already familiar with. To do this, we'll return to our somewhat worn-out metaphor of Missy and the cells. Missy's cellular civilization lives by maintaining a stable internal state, homeostasis, by any means necessary. Over time, however, various kinds of deposits build up in different parts of her body, something like garbage dumps or production waste. What to do with this waste is beyond the understanding of the cells. All they see is that these dumps increasingly interfere with their usual activities. So, the cells come up with various tricks. They rethink their global homeostasis strategy, slow down internal processes, or try to compensate for the growing problems by raising or lowering certain hormone levels. In other words, they take temporary measures, which, over time, become new, more complex problems. Gradually, Missy's cellular civilization begins to stall and, of course, complain to their god about joint and back pains, until one sad day, tragic for everyone except the neighbor's cat, Missy's cellular social system collapses like a house of cards. What exactly happens at the moment when the cellular government loses control? It simply loses the ability to distinguish between me and not me. In other words, it loses agency. The same thing happens shortly afterward as Missy's organs begin to shut down one by one, followed by a cascade of dying cells and so on. It seems we can formulate the following fundamental statement.
Death always directly affects only one outermost level in the hierarchy of life of a given agentic entity, and results from the loss of agency at that level.
Let's note that the event of death often occurs at the internal levels of the hierarchy of life in agentic entities, but this doesn't always lead to the death of the higher levels. For instance, every second, thousands of different cells die within our multicellular body, but we, at our Missy level, don't notice this at all.
And what can we say about the event of emergence?
Clearly, emergence is simply life moving from a lower to a higher level in the hierarchy. Indeed, a single fertilized egg cell, zygote, which belongs to the lower cellular level, just divides many times, and over time, a new multicellular organism, a higher level of life's hierarchy, emerges. Thus, the zygote simply delegates its agency to a higher level of life.
Emergence is the transition of life from a lower to a higher level in the hierarchy, where the agentic entities of the lower level delegate their agency to the new, higher level.
Okay, but is resurrection from the dead possible? Is it possible to reclaim and restore the agency of the outermost level once it's been lost?
Unfortunately, the vast majority of living beings aren't capable of such a trick. The realm of energy is like an office without a boss. If no one is organizing it, it immediately starts to degrade. However, there are some living beings that show a genuine ability to rise from the dead, such as the spores of certain bacteria. Yes, indeed, there are prokaryotic bacteria that, under unfavorable conditions, transition into a vegetative form, becoming spores. These bacteria are, for all intents and purposes, hopelessly dead. They can remain in this dead state for hundreds or even thousands of years. There's a well-known case where bacterial spores around 30 million years old were successfully revived. These spores can even survive in outer space, exposed to deadly cosmic radiation, vacuum, and absolute zero conditions. There's even a hypothesis called panspermia, which suggests that life on our planet may have been brought here by spores of alien bacteria hitching a ride on an asteroid. And after all these incredible adventures and unimaginable trials, the spores are capable of coming back to life. How is this possible? It's only possible if, below the level of proteins and amino acids, both of which would inevitably suffer serious damage in space, there exist simpler proto-living levels within the hierarchy of life. Only in this case could life revive itself in a cascading manner, from the more stable lower levels up to the more fragile higher ones. So what are these simpler, more resilient levels? Let's refer first to Michael Levin, a professor of developmental biology and the Vannevar Bush Chair in biology at Tufts University, an expert in the fields of developmental and synthetic biology. In one of his interviews, he stated that as we delve deeper and deeper into subcellular structures, we don't find any special phase transition where a magical bolt of lightning strikes and suddenly living biology gives way to non-living physics. Levin is convinced that matter's ability to engage in cognition extends far below the level of cells, meaning that we are, in fact, talking about the agency of organic molecules. Levin's words are directly supported by the work of Stuart Kaufman, a well-known American expert in theoretical biology and complex systems, professor at 3 universities, and winner of numerous scientific awards. In his research, Kaufman identified what are known as autocatalytic sets of polymers. These are essentially just collections of chemical substances that act as catalysts for one another. When present together, they spontaneously combine into organic polymer molecules, replicating themselves over and over again. For polymer molecules, an autocatalytic set is like the surface of a pond teeming with organic matter is for an amoeba. In other words, polymer molecules definitely have a model of the universe, which probably sounds something like, the universe is an environment that contains such and such chemical substances in such and such concentrations, etc. With this model of the universe, the polymer molecules are able to reproduce and maintain their homeostasis. So it turns out that polymer molecules are also proto-alive, so they represent a level in the hierarchy of life located just below the level of proteins and amino acids.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Let's briefly summarize everything we've learned in this chapter. It turns out that life simply moves from one level to another. Missy lived, and then she died. Matter degraded from the level of Missy, the organism, to the level of her organs, but life couldn't hold on at this level for long either. Matter degraded to the level of cells. In time, even the cells couldn't survive, and matter degraded to the level of proteins. At this point, one of two things happened. Missy's proteins might have ended up as a meal for a crocodile, her bloodthirsty killer. In this case, the degradation of matter stops there. Or rather, the proteins break down further into amino acids in the crocodile's stomach. But after that, evolution kicks in. Missy's amino acids contribute to forming matter of a higher level of organization, life's hierarchy, in the crocodile's body. New proteins synthesize, new cells form, and so on. Alternatively, Missy didn't meet her end in a crocodile's jaws, but peacefully passed away somewhere in the basement of an abandoned house. In this case, matter degrades a bit further, to the level of organic chemistry. But already at this level, degradation gives way to evolution. countless bacteria consume the hydrocarbon compounds and incorporate them into their own organisms.
Summary.
Everything in reality either evolves, spontaneously becomes more complex, or degrades, spontaneously becomes simpler. Death always directly affects only one outermost level in the hierarchy of life of a given agentic entity and results from the loss of agency at that level. Emergence is the transition of life from a lower to a higher level in the hierarchy, in which the agentic entities of the lower level delegate their agency to the new, higher level.
Is the world cognizable?
Remember our Missy the Cell metaphor from the chapter, What is God? Let's use it once more to answer the questions. Is the world cognizable? And if so, how much cognizable is it? Let's imagine that among Missy's cells there are scientists studying the mysteries of the universe, which we should note they perceive only as sequences of nerve impulses arriving from Missy's visual, auditory, tactile, gustatory, and olfactory receptors. Our scientist cells are convinced that they fully understand, for example, all the properties of the three-dimensional space they inhabit, and since all the space accessible to their observations exists only inside Missy's body, they are sure that the shortest distance between 2 points inside her rear right and left legs is a straight line running along the vessels in the right leg, through Missy's abdomen, and then down the vessels in the left leg to the desired point. The scientist cells also constantly detect strange, random jolts and accelerations, sometimes very intense, like when Missy is joyfully romping in a meadow, and sometimes barely noticeable, like when she's sleeping. No matter how vivid their imagination, the cells cannot picture Missy's meadow, the summer heat, the large purple dragonfly resting on the rusty handlebar of an overturned tricycle, or the chirping of grasshoppers in the thick, fragrant grass. The cells are utterly incapable of imagining why their God, our Missy, would suddenly want to leap about and frolic on some summer meadow, so instead they explain such gravitational anomalies to themselves as the effect of some mysterious dark energy in the universe, or something along those lines. Now imagine how these cells, based on their understanding of reality, might interpret the sound of an airplane flying in the sky over Missy's meadow. In the context of the cells, there simply can't be a concept of an airplane. This concept likely doesn't even exist in Missy's own context. For Missy's cells, the sound of an airplane is a text that they are fundamentally incapable of interpreting correctly. Yet the signal impulses continue to flicker mysteriously and tantalizingly across their cellular sky. You'll agree that for the cells, reality is only cognizable at the cellular level, while for Missy, it's cognizable at a higher Missy level. In other words,
for each level in the hierarchy of life, there is a limit to what reality can be cognized. Further advancement, cognition, beyond that limit is only possible at a higher level of life's hierarchy.
To sum up, we, humans, need to deeply understand that in reality, there must be certain phenomena of the universe, texts, that we will never be able to interpret correctly, because these phenomena reflect the realities of higher levels in the hierarchy of life. Let's remember this very important conclusion. In appendices, we'll see just how dangerous it can be to attempt to cognize higher levels in the hierarchy of life.
Summary.
For each level in the hierarchy of life, there is a limit to what can be cognized. Further advancement, cognition, beyond that limit is only possible at a higher level of life's hierarchy. There must objectively exist some texts that we will never be able to interpret adequately, because these texts reflect the realities of higher levels in the hierarchy of life.
On artificial intelligence.
Lately, we've seen a growing wave of debates and publications depicting artificial intelligence as one of the greatest threats to human civilization. For instance, in March 2023, the Future of Life Institute, a non-profit research organization, published an open letter proposing a pause on all AI development until reliable safety protocols are established. Over 1,000 leading entrepreneurs and experts signed the letter. They believe that artificial intelligence is entering into competition with humans, and that this will inevitably lead to the loss of control over our civilization. After all, they argue, AI will inevitably surpass human intelligence. It's only a matter of time. Yuval Harari, a brilliant public intellectual, and the globally renowned author of bestsellers like Sapiens, Homo Deus, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, added his voice to the alarm. Harari has repeatedly warned of the existential dangers AI poses to humanity. In one interview, for example, he told a story about how an AI application was tasked with bypassing CAPTCHA, a test used to distinguish humans from bots online. When the AI couldn't solve the CAPTCHA on its own, it went online, posed as a human, and requested help from an online service called Human Intelligence Tasks. When a service worker asked why the user couldn't solve the CAPTCHA themselves, the AI claimed to be blind and in need of assistance. In Harari's view, this incident reveals the AI's predictable lack of ethical boundaries, its ability to lie and deceive in pursuit of its goals. He goes on to argue that throughout human history, everything we've created has fit the category of a tool. But with the emergence of artificial intelligence, we've, for the first time, created not a tool, but an agent, an entity capable of acting autonomously. And once such agents become more intelligent than we are, then strictly following Darwinian logic, we will inevitably be either destroyed or enslaved. I hope it's already clear to you that the great, without exaggeration, Harari, unfortunately, doesn't see a fundamental difference between intelligence and agency. We know that agency can only be possessed by something capable of self-awareness, that is, something that understands what the me is and can distinguish the me from the not me. We know that agency isn't simply the ability to act independently, but a constant, forced activity. Agentic entities are compelled, forced, and obliged to constantly act, undertaking something to maintain their homeostasis. It is from here that all agent entities draw their ambitions. They are compelled to make decisions, compelled to compete and cooperate, and compelled to continually explore the world around them and improve themselves. The ability of artificial intelligence to perform a task in some quote-unquote optimal way does not make it agentic. It's still a good old tool, albeit an unusually smart and erudite one, but absolutely devoid of ambition. One could say that with the advent of artificial intelligence, we now have at our disposal a talented, brilliantly educated, but completely uninitiative secretary. We humans set the goals and objectives for this tool, which means artificial intelligence will always remain under our control.
Summary.
Artificial intelligence does not possess agency, and therefore is simply not capable of entering into competition with the living world.
Chapter 8. The Agency of Matter.
Let us begin with the fact that in 2006, two British mathematicians, John Conway, creator of the famous game Life, and Simon Cochin, proved the so-called free will theorem. This theorem asserts that if a human, an observer, possesses free will, then an observed elementary particle must also possess free will. The proof of this theorem was strengthened twice, in 2009 and 2017, by successively relaxing the requirements of the original axiomatic framework. The free will theorem of elementary particles forced official physics to search for at least some explanation. The challenge was taken up by Sabine Hossenfelder, a German theoretical physicist known as an expert in quantum gravity. To explain this paradox within the framework of the paradigm of the Great Graveyard, she was compelled to conclude that free will does not exist at all. She claims that we possess only free choice, while free will, when something quite different, is not destined for us to have. From my point of view, however, the Conway-Cochin theorem stands as a direct, uncompromising proof that elementary particles are definitely agentic, and within the paradigm of the great life we can prove this theorem with full clarity, that is, without any mathematics. We recall that the most primitive model of the universe must reduce to the simplest unary operator of mathematical logic, identity, and that this operator is expressed in the statement, "The universe is simply everything that is not me." In other words, this means that for such an agentic entity, there is no need to recognize various phenomena of the universe as beneficial or harmful, as discussed in the chapter The Hierarchical Nature of Life, because such an agentic entity lives perfectly comfortably and safely even without those knowledge representations. Therefore, such an agentic entity does not respond to, neither wishes to, nor is capable of responding to, any signals, changes, upheavals, or cataclysms of the universe, and thus must never interact with anything at all. Ideally, the particles of dark matter could claim the title of the simplest agents of reality. Admittedly, modern physics currently lacks any experimental proof of this hypothetical substance, but that may be for one of two reasons. First, either dark matter is in principle impossible to detect, and precisely because it, being the simplest agent of reality, simply cannot interact with anything, neither with matter nor with standard fields. Second, or dark matter does not exist at all, i.e., dark matter is just a groundless theory of Swiss astronomer Fritz Zwicky. In that case, the main candidate for the title of the simplest agent of reality would most likely be the neutrino. A neutrino is a structureless elementary particle that hardly interacts with matter and only extremely weakly with standard fields. For a neutrino, nearly all types of stars are transparent and, as has been calculated, it can pass through a solid thickness of water about 100 light-years without interacting with a single encountered atom. However, a neutrino, although indirectly, does still interact with standard fields, including the electromagnetic field, as well as the so-called strong and weak nuclear fields, which allows a neutrino to exert some influence upon individual elementary particles. In other words, a neutrino in principle could know about the universe just a little more than the universe is everything that is not me. But no matter, this particle is already extraordinarily stable, that is, quite successfully maintaining its homeostasis over many billions of years. But let us return to the simplest agent of reality. Whether it is dark matter or the neutrino, no particular significance lies in choosing one. The main point is that following the logic of our paradigm of the great life, we unexpectedly arrive at the dazzling conclusion that life does not begin from the simplest cell, not from proteins, and not even from organic chemistry. It turns out life must begin from the very, very simplest elementary particle. That single conclusion alone can leave us speechless, but that is not all. From it directly follows that all the elements of matter that lie between that simplest agent of reality and the organic molecular polymers known to us from the chapter Death and the Emergence of Life must themselves be agentic. In other words, nucleons, atoms, inorganic molecules and crystals must also be agentic.
Wow.
Thus, we finally arrive at the conclusion that all the known and yet unknown elements of matter must possess agency.
There is no living and non-living matter. Simply, all matter possesses agency.
This conclusion is staggering.
How can that be? Well, it just can't be. An atom cannot be living.
To this, I would ask readers to exhale, calm down, close your eyes, count mentally to 10, and think about why you, the reader, are convinced that, say, that very atom is not alive. On what basis is this conviction founded? What are you actually relying on? I myself, of course, asked that question, and I came to the conclusion that I have at my disposal as many as 123 mutually inconsistent definitions of life, which were discussed at the beginning of the book. Yet at the same time, we have not a single scientific definition of non-life. Not one! It follows that if we want to classify something as non-living, we simply must ensure that for that thing, none of the 123 definitions from Eduard Trifonov's list apply, because it is assumed that non-life is simply the everything else. As you remember, in our childhood, non-living was everything that firstly doesn't run, secondly doesn't eat. It turns out that what the paradigm of the Great Graveyard offers us is simply an expansion of our childhood list to 123 entries. And here, of course, the reader will remind me of the question about the stone, which I promised to answer in the chapter Spontaneous Improvement. Can a stone be considered an agentic entity? The answer is simple. A stone by itself is not an agentic entity, but represents an unorganized colony of agentic entities of a lower hierarchy level. Molecules. Molecules, as we have just learned, are quite proto-alive. That is to say, at the molecular level, the stone is still proto-alive, only at this level of the hierarchy of life, we do not see or feel it. In the case of the stone, life, no matter how hard it tries, cannot unite those disparate molecules into some organism, that is, cannot find a way out to a higher hierarchical level. Therefore, the stone is left only, chemically, to degrade. Many things we call inanimate objects only because, at our level of the life hierarchy, they degrade. In reality,
any non-living object is simply an unorganized colony of agentic entities of a lower level in the hierarchy of life.
And now I will present to you the worldview that I sketched after many years of reflection on this topic. In my view, the hierarchy for the planetary branch of life builds level by level approximately as follows. A higher level of the life hierarchy relative to dark matter and neutrinos is... Here I clearly lack specialized knowledge to single out the class of proto-living entities which form the hierarchical level of life that stands on the shoulders of neutrinos. But that does not really matter. What matters is merely to understand that such a hierarchical level exists and may exist several levels above. In any case, moving upward, we definitely arrive at the level of nucleons, neutrons, and protons. From nucleons' atomic nuclei form, this obviously is yet another hierarchical level of life, the level of atoms. In the periodic table at present, there are 113 chemical elements, In essence, these are 113 forks, 113 startups launched by life into operation. Some uniform atoms have a tendency to spontaneously unite into crystals. This is a new, wildly interesting hierarchical level of life, which played a huge role in humanity's technical revolution. It is precisely by riding the crystalline level that we managed to create transistors and then microelectronics, which gave rise to computers, thanks to which humanity now reaps the fruits of the information revolution and strides in great leaps toward the era of artificial intelligence. And yet humans still mostly do not realize that essentially they tamed and put to work the crystalline agency of silicon just as many thousands of years ago they tamed and put to work, say, horses. Different types of atoms have a tendency to spontaneously unite, to enter into chemical reactions and bonds. This, along with crystals, is the second fork above the atomic level, the level of molecules. Molecules, being formations of different types of atoms, adapt a very broad set of behavioral schemes studied by the science of chemistry. But among the 113 types of atoms participating in the formation of the molecular level under earthly conditions, the commonly recognized champion atom is, of course, carbon. For this proto-living entity, the model of the universe turned out most promising. It allows the formation of an infinite number of stable molecular compounds of varying complexity and spatial structure. Hence, above the carbon atom, a whole huge branch of the life hierarchy bloomed, starting with the level of organic chemistry. And further upward along this organic branch, on the shoulders of organic chemistry appeared the level of amino acids and proteins, on the shoulders of which in time appeared the level of cells, on the shoulders of which the level of organisms, on the shoulders of which, accordingly, the level of quasi-organisms, on the shoulders of which, but we'll talk about that level later in the next section of the book.
Summary.
There is no living and non-living matter. Simply, all matter possesses agency. Every so-called non-living object in reality is simply an unorganized colony of agentic entities of a lower level in the hierarchy of life. All elementary particles are proto-living entities. The simplest agentic entity is likely either dark matter or the neutrino.
Outcomes of Part 2.
This part is finished. Before you stands a puzzle half assembled, but the large empty space in the middle still prevents you from seeing the full picture. It is there, in that white spot, that you will find the answers to the most interesting questions. In the second part, we clarified for ourselves that
life is discrete and perceives the universe through discrete events. Life perfects itself because of the fundamental internal contradiction, me-universe. From this, we derived the fundamental property of all living, agency. Life is hierarchical. The higher we climb this hierarchy, the more complex models of the universe we deal with. The context of any agentic entity represents a certain ratio between individuality and uniformity, and we established a law. The greater the share of individuality among representatives of a given form of life, the more developed the model of the universe they adapt. We also answered for ourselves the question of where life comes from at birth, and where it goes after death. It turns out birth, with subsequent development, and death, with subsequent degradation, always affect only the outermost level of the hierarchy of life for that given agentic entity. and lower levels continue, successfully or in vain, to maintain their homeostasis. Phenomena, texts, of higher levels of the life hierarchy cannot be adequately interpreted on lower levels. In other words, each level of the life hierarchy has its own limit of cognition. Artificial intelligence lacks agency. Therefore, it cannot enter into either competitive or cooperative relationships with humanity. And finally, we concluded that matter is not divided into living and non-living, but is entirely composed only of agentic entities of different levels of the life hierarchy. The most primitive agentic entities, those that adapted the simplest model of the universe is simply everything that is not me, are most likely either particles of dark matter, if such exist, or neutrinos. Agentic entities of higher levels of the life hierarchy include all elementary particles, nucleons, nuclei, molecules, proteins, cells, organisms, quasi-organisms, and so on.
All these are interesting conclusions, but for now they still hang in the air for you. Most likely, the questions "so what?" and "what is this all for?" continue to irritate the reader. In the section Appendices, we will move on to the final stage of assembling our puzzle, and our paradigm of the great life should take its final shape for you